Welcome, everyone. My name is Jill Quito. I lead the marketing team at Metrics, and I will be moderating today's webinar, the 10 metrics and KPIs to manage your workforce for operational excellence. These metrics are aimed for people who want to manage their operations teams and processes to operate efficiently and drive out waste, while simultaneously driving engagement in your workforce and making your operation a great place to work. So for this webinar, phones are muted, and you'll notice a Q&A box. And if you click on that, you can submit your questions. So we asked you to use the Q&A box to submit your questions instead of the chat box. And today's speaker is Karl Kohler, who is a seasoned expert at driving operational efficiencies, managing distribution centers for many of the top retailers and 3PLs in the world. Karl is the Chief Operations Officer at Metrics, and I am very excited about today's session, learning the real world pro tips and the behind the scenes scoop on what makes highly performant facilities tick, where operators are highly engaged and invested. Welcome, Karl.
Thank you, Jill. Appreciate it very much. So let's kind of get started here to walk through the grouping. So first of all, thank you, Jill and the team putting this together. I'm always excited about doing these presentations, both internally and externally here. We do this a lot with a lot of our current clients and past clients. This is always fun going through these exercises. And this is one in which where the 10 metrics questions are come up. What are the key drivers in business? And this comes up a lot in our industry that we've talked through. And we thought it was important to do this today and kind of walk big picture what some of these areas are. Talk maybe some of the toolings we use, and look forward to hearing some questions you guys have out there at the end of this presentation. So let's kind of get started here. Why standardization operation metrics? Why do we have this? And I always like starting with the story about how Metrics was, initiated, how we first built this thing, right? Two partners of mine, Dean Dorcas and Dan Quito, started a company back in '96 called IMS, Integrated Management Systems. We were a outsourced or a 4PL company. And in that market, we did a lot of work, essentially working both on projects that may last 2-3 days, 2-3 weeks, or months or years. And we would do projects at a piece rate, a cost per unit. And it was really important for us, as you can probably tell, that we were on the hook on productivity. End of the day, we had a fixed rate per unit we had to meet. And it'd be everything from kitting projects to devanning, unloading, loading projects, to working pick, pack operations, special projects like that. So it's really important to really start driving metrics and be able to give that visibility both at a micro level, frontline level, all the way to macro level, which is the C-suite, the executive team. So we really talk about why we do this thing, right? Improve decision making, right? Driving performance at the individual level, at the team level, right, or shift level. Right. Setting objective standards. I think this is really important. We'll get deeper in this conversation about productivity. That I talk a lot about being fair and consistent, right? And then there's ways of how do you do that, right? Do you use engineer standards? Do you use data-driven standards to do that, right? And there's a couple of ways we can talk about that opportunity, right? You want everyone speaking the same language. At our company in the past life and at Metrics, we use very unique terminologies you'll hear today. If you've been with us in the past and work with us currently now, you'll hear things like ELS, you'll hear things like effectiveness score, right? And it's really important as we drive this through from the executive level down the front line that everyone needs to be on the same page, speaking the same language, right? And being in alignment, the company, goal alignment is really important. We talk about this, that the goals at the corporate level, right? Both on profitability, volumes, et cetera, that's being driven down all the way down to the unit level. And by having the consistencies of metrics, right, you're able to do so. And ultimately, your end user, your client, your customer, you want them to have the great experience in that deal, right? So let's kind of walk through some of these here. Goals. Important as we talk about this thing. We talk about I use terminology, two things, right? The what and the why, right? What are the goals, right? And we talk about the what. The why is, you can talk about some of these other items here too, but the why behind this is the following, right? Providing the data-driven standards for improvement. Industrial engineers, big on this deal. To know where you guys stand and where the improvements are, important to have that, right? Empowering your employees, right? Again, this can be done both on just visibility, speaking to the individual's performance, talk about how they're performing both at individual level and at a shift level or a department level, and what their costs are. It's interesting, and we talk about kind of experiences through optimization, right? Better customer experiences. It's interesting, at least in my line of work, where I work through this, is where you see performance also drives productivity and also drives quality. When we're doing volumes that we have, both high and low volumes in an operation, it's interesting as you go through that when you're driving visibility of goals, quality seems to go up instead of down. I know it's counterintuitive. You're trying to push in goals and getting people working faster in that process. You think people are skipping processes, but if you're being more deliberate, what I've seen in my experiences, and you still track it, right? You still track the quality side, but you're able to deliver better customer experiences by that, right? Being able to be profitable in your market. If you're a 3PL, this is a big one, right? If you're up against it with other groups here, being profitable and being able to be competitive is important to keep your clients, right? And last, keeping great people. Now you can go several directions on this. You can do the classic one is that you're setting goals. You can do a pay for performance program. You can incentivize people to do that. I take it to the side that good people, great performers, good performers want to know how they are. I think in most operations, people, they don't know what they don't know, right? And I think it's really important as you show those experiences in the performances, people are engaged. You get them engaged in the process. And I think that's important to have those as you set goals. Okay. Who uses these goals, right? Let's talk about that for a second here. In our business line in E3 using metrics here, we really work through different levels from the C-suite, executive team, all the way down to the front line. I'll talk in a second about cadence and such forth, but you'll see in our reporting tools, we use different types for different uses. And again, for different timelines, right? If I'm talking about a supervisor or team lead, they may be one looking at reporting and goals on a daily basis or even hourly basis, right? How things are going. Where you've the other end of the spectrum, now you're looking at the general manager, COO. They're looking for more macro. How do they do for the week? How do we do for the month, right? How are we doing against forecast and the goals? So again, as you use this, you see really all levels. It really comes down to what they're trying to drive, what they're looking for, and it really turns into the frequency. When is it valuable? We talk about that. I mentioned this earlier, right? About the cadence, right? What reporting, what are you using? When is it valuable? And I'll use the same thing, and I'll use a couple of use cases here, right? We talk about at a micro level, right? Toolings that we've used before is a couple of things, right? Having toolings of reporting at your group, your department level here. Who's performing the best? Who has the groups we have opportunity on, right? There's reporting tools to be able to do that. There's ones where you look at the daily's performance overall, the whole facility for the day, and look at shift 1 versus shift 2. How are they doing? You look at quarter reviews, both on the finance side. How are we doing versus budget, right? And then you have monthly goals and leadership. We talk a lot about having a scorecard and giving them on a monthly or quarterly basis how the employee is doing, how the lead's doing in their grouping, right? So you'll have the timing and cadence is important to be able to show value in the goals. So let's talk about it. We have 10 metrics we felt are really important in both business lines. We've broken it up into 4 groups. Labor metrics, and we'll talk the subsets of those. Cost metrics, time metrics, and I call it 3PL metrics, but I would call it kind of the end user, right? That side, and go those groups. And we have those broken out accordingly. So let's kind of go to the first one. Let's kind of work through labor metrics. And there's 3 that I look at, and I always consider be kind of the baseline important. One is the productivity metrics, or the goal. 2 is the effectiveness percentage or goal. And 3rd is overtime percentage. So let's go to each one and talk about each one individually here for a second. So productivity, we call it, or at Easy Metrics, we call it ELS, Employee Labor Score. And You can use that scoring both at an individual level. I consider that the same type of scoring rolled up at a department level, shift level. And really the key is these goals really identify the person's performance and what they did the activity for that day. We talk a lot about being fair and consistent, right? In this example, we'll talk about this for a second. This is, you see the picture here. We're tracking two metrics here in this example, right? We're tracking pallets and travel, right? This is probably a pretty classic put away process, right? And essentially you set a labor standard and set a baseline based on performance. And we mentioned before, you can do that off data driven. You can do it off engineer standards, right? The key is you're having the same thing, the same values being driven if Johnny's doing it or Susie's doing it, right? And it really drives that accountability by having the visibility of how the performance is scored and making it fair, right? In this example, we're not doing pallets per hour. We're also considering feet, right? You know, different examples of operations. Some people do directed put away, some do zone put away, right? Well, as long as you're consistent in that process, in that facility, how you're doing it, right? You're able to track how much touches you have, but this is the distance you're going. That's really important. We talk about those two things here, right? Let's go to the next one here. I call this one the equalizer. And I use this for many ways. So let me give you a description of the definition of what we call effectiveness, right? Effectiveness is kind of the end all be all of aggregating really three things together. One, it tracks one's productivity, right? How he or she's doing during that day or that time period, right? It also tells you how they're being utilized. And utilized, I consider that as how many in a full day, how many hours are being direct labor out of the total day, right? And then the third one is, and we'll talk about this later on time metrics here, but missing time, gap time where they work during the 8 hours, but we're not quite sure what they're doing. This envelops all three of those together. And the reason I call this the equalizer, and I can give several use cases, but one in particular we worked with recently here out in the Midwest, where site A, great performers, right? They set their baseline of productivity, they set it to 80%, right? And they're running about 130%, 6 months later, doing a fantastic job. But the effectiveness is less than 100%. Why was that, right? Another site, they may only been at 103% score, right? But they're 3 points higher on the effectiveness because they're managing missing time, they're managing indirect, and they're driving value. And funny enough, we'll talk about cost metrics. Their cost per unit, and they do pallets, by the way, as they're kind of the cost driver, is 10 cents cheaper per pallet because of that. So it isn't always how effective, I guess, how productive you are per se, but it's the overall effectiveness across all three of those. And I think when people ask about the health of an operation, I use this one as the baseline to use across the board when I use that related to productivity. Okay. Third one, this to me, at my past life working in logistics, always can bite you in the butt, right? You can have a fantastic week on performance and individuals in your shifts, but if you aren't managing the overtime, all that gain goes away by the end of the week if you don't manage that. So what do you do? How do you handle that deal, right? A couple things, right? You're managing that both on a daily basis. You're looking at by the shift. You're looking at certain departments. You're trying to find out where the trends are going. Many times it's going to be, you'll catch it the next day where you'll be able to see the trends of when you build in your forecast and you'll be able to see that a week and out. The big key from my side when you're doing overtime and managing this process is being proactive. We have a tool that we call a planning tool, a forecasting tool we have. And I always recommend for groups to have and use this here, particularly when you're going into peak. You may have multiple peaks in a year, right? If you're in a classic retail peak, you're starting bringing the inbound in July, August, maybe September, right? And then you're starting doing the picking here, going through during the holidays here, right? There's a planning period that I always recommend to build that in advance. Get the information, what you believe the forecast is going to be, build up 10% of that as a float, right? And build the staff and train before that comes in. I know everyone's on the call, but yeah, Carl, we know that, but it's really important on the forecasting tool, look at all areas, right? It isn't apples to apples. How you're going to forecast your receiving team is not going to be the same how you're going to forecast your pick and pack team. First of all, different standards completely. Two, volumes are going to be completely different, and they overlap. right? One doesn't happen at the same time as the other one, right? So it's important to be proactive on this on the front end, just as important on the back end when the season's over to be able to forecast the back end, because now you're sitting with a lot of staff. How quickly are you able to send those individuals to other productive areas, or to, cut down to the baseline of group, right? Somebody at the point of using contingent workforce, that you're going to cut those down pretty quickly to get your right size staffing. But the forecasting, that's really important to get to the overtime opportunities. Let's go to the next group now, costing metrics here. I broke this up into 3 areas also. One's kind of a cost per unit. One's kind of cost to serve. We'll talk about that in a little more detail. And then metric ratios, which I always find important, intriguing as you're going through your analysis on your P&L. Let's do the first one here, right? Cost per unit. We run operations here. We build out our tooling and visibility. It's important for us to get that denominator consistent across the board. What do I mean by that? If you're in the full distribution center, right, you're bringing in trailers, containers. They're either going to be pallet-based or case-based brought in, right? Either on the floor or pallet in, right? You're going to pick, right? Is picking going to be a case pick, pallet pick, or each pick? You may have all 3. Then you have your packing, right? You have a master pack. Then you have your outbound shipping. So it's really important as a client, we give recommendations to our clients, what's going to be a baseline cost metric? What are you going to use? Classically, most people use case, right? Some use an each, right? If they're all e-com, right? But it's important to kind of standardize that across the board from alpha to omega on the process to do so, or to keep that consistency and know your cost per unit across the board. Once you do that and you're apples to apples, now when you have multi-facilities within a market or across country, you have the ability to compare apples to apples at that point. Now, there's an argument you can have, well, Carl, the cost of an employee or forklift operator in Dallas is going to be different than what it's going to be in Boston. All right, can be. There's a couple of choices you can make in that deal, right? One is you can standardize the same cost unit, cost per hour across the board, fully burdened across all facilities. So you can really see apples to apples that way. Second option, say, look, I really want to know the difference between Boston and Dallas. Cost is more in Boston. I got to understand that and be able to understand how do I handle pricing on that. At least gives you the baseline of consistency, and 2, the second one is able to compare apples to apples across the board. Okay. Let's go to the next one. Cost to serve by facility. Similar functionality we talked about before on the cost per unit. Now we're going to study cost per unit and build cost to serve across each facility, right? Same thing applies, right? And this could be by multi-metrics here. We can do it by effectiveness, right? In this example, we're doing cost per unit, but you can do it across the board on indirect percentages. All right, any of those deals to be the cost to serve across the board. It's blended, it's aggregate. It's important to be able to do that, to be able to handle understanding labor costs of one facility versus the other. And that may come all the way down to a process level, right? Maybe things are looking great in receiving side, but you really want to understand what's going on packing or the picking department here and be able to splice it out. I think it's real important as you build that to have those breakpoints to be able to compare apples to apples instead of just an aggregate cost per unit coming in versus out completely of total labor. Able to splice that's going to be important to make decisions down the road. Next one is, and we use example here, distance travel per unit, but this is really, I call this metric ratios. And you could do this multiple ways, right? You can use, this is an example of feet per pallet, right? Example, we're using put away as another example, but you can use on picking ratios of lines and SKUs by orders. You can use receiving, which you can use as ratios of cases versus splits in trailers, right? It was always interesting. One example, particularly, we work with a large retailer. We were doing a great job, the team, over 130% scoring and productivity. And at the end of the week, we're looking at our profits and we just weren't there, right? We're in single digits. And that's, for us, that was unacceptable. We wanted to be at a 25% gross margin. We're in the low teens, right? Or in the single digits. We quickly found out by using metric ratios what the problem was, right? And the problem we had in that use case was our ratio, the amount of splits we had on unloading in a trailer, quadrupled, right? 4 times the amount. So the team was doing a great job that week, but that week we had an opportunity where we had bad freight. Now, obviously, it self-corrected itself throughout the month, but if you don't have that and you're thinking there's one dimensional, not being able to look at that ratio, the ratios that are cost drivers, you can get surprised real quickly if you don't understand that and see that. And I think it's always important in your business to know what those baseline metric ratios need to be managing that on a daily and weekly basis. Okay. Let's go to the next one, time metrics. We're going to talk about two groupings here. We're going to talk about indirect and one of my favorites, which I call missing time or gap time. So let's do the first one here. Let's do indirect here. Similar as we talked about before, which is kind of setting a baseline. I think it's important when you build toolings to be able to track indirect. And there's several ways we can talk about tracking. We can do that in a moment here. But build it in such a way that's going to be impactful and it's not overwhelming. What do I mean by that? Impactful are the baseline processes that are non-revenue generated that you are going to be able to manage off of. 6 to 8 indirect processes is a big difference than trying to manage 23 indirect processes. I would argue 23 indirect processes are pretty excessive in a classic distribution center. So pick carefully what those are, right? So you can drive those. And then when you're doing that, keep that consistent across the board. If you have multi-facilities, that you're apples to apples there also, right? And then you can start being able to take action and say, site A is going to be, in this example, in Memphis, 34%. Well, let's find out where the 34% is coming from. Maybe there was a month where they had training cost, and that's going to be normal, right? Or you find out what's a bunch of cleaning going on. Well, is a team really managing its cleaning time versus training time? Me, I'm willing to put the money into the training side. I'm also into putting in cleaning time, but that cleaning time, my experience should be when you're doing the process, not after that's a fact. So at least you'll be able to take action by having that. So I think the summation there is important to know that and know where your cost driver is, because we talked about effectiveness, right? Earlier on labor metrics, be able to track the indirect time is 1/3 of that, and be able to have that consistent, meaningful, and be able to track that at down to the individual level is important. One last, and I'll share with the deal, and this is always an important one. I think people ask, they may come up in a question, how do you track indirect, right? Several ways in my experience. One is your WMS system. You guys have the ability to code in to a certain process and be able to do that. That's one option I've seen facilities use. I've seen people use their time clock system. Chronos is a great example where you can job code out of there. We have a tool called Job Track, which is another module. We put that as a platform. You can place them on the floor and they can track themselves in and out of those processes too. And that could be for, again, same thing, cleaning, could be value-added service work that you don't have scans on, you could use. Any one of those is important to be able to track those out. Okay, let's go to the next one. One of my favorites, and I probably would say and argue anyone on this call that this is probably your biggest ROI, hands down. At Easy Metric, we use a rollout methodology called the 30, 60, 90-day rollout, which is, each segment talks about a certain area. And the first thing we discuss and really drive home to the frontline team is managing your missing time. What does that mean? Pretty simple. If I have 8 hours of work, if I have John Smith doing that, I expect 8 hours worth of productivity. When we turn this tooling on and this visibility on, I can almost guarantee you 30% to 40% missing time you'll see right off the bat on day one. Now, where does that come from? I would call half and half, right? Half would be employees, they don't know what they don't know, meaning they aren't used to tracking into an indirect process, or they're just not used to being able to be vigilant on that. So that takes some training. That takes 2-3 weeks to get employees used to that new cadence. The other side is you're going to find people just not being effective out there, not working. Where do I see that? And these are not any big, large insights here, big surprises. It always seems at the beginning of clock in, beginning of the day, there seems to be always a gap time. After lunch is always another one. And end of day, it's fun to say. I always find it interesting when you start running these reports that the clock out to 4 o'clock, right around 3:35, 3:40 is their last activity, and they go dark. So having tools to be able to show that type of visibility, I think is huge. I would say for our experience, over a third, almost a half of a lot of your ROI can come from that alone. We really talk about that first. Missing time is first. We go to indirect management next. And then last but not least, then we're talking about productivity. But this one, to me, is a really important one to really drive home and be able to see that visibility. Okay. Let's go to the next one here. 3PL metrics, or we call it use cases where you're billing labor for an end user, right? Let's talk about that for a second here, okay? I call it metric 9, and this is really a classic model on a 3PL operation, right? Where you have an operation where you may have 12 clients in there, right? And maybe you're lucky enough that you're doing the same genre. Maybe you're doing all outdoor gear, let's say, right? But each client has different SOPs, right? Client A has you touching during a packing station, 3 different steps. Client B has 7 different steps. Are you pricing accordingly, right? Are you following the process correctly, right? Being able to see those drivers, I call it kind of the 80-20 rule. Usually 80% of your profit comes 20% of your clients, and vice versa. So when you have that 80%, right, and you have opportunities at 20% causing the issue, we're calling 80% causing the issue, right, and be able to drive. To me, that's important to be able to see that. And we built toolings in place on our side to be able to just not do the cost to serve, but also profit to serve, to be able to see that. Now, what's that frequency look like? Me personally, I like things weekly in this model. It's hard to get a daily because you see a lot of trends up and down throughout the week, Monday through Friday, but get a weekly performance tooling to be able to show that is important. Absolutely monthly. You got to have the monthly. You got to make decisions, and the decisions are either going to be internal decisions of improving processes. It's going to be pricing conversations with the clients. A lot of things you can be handling by knowing where you're at instead of a surprise on your P&L the following month and see what happened. And maybe not knowing what's going on because you don't have the tooling to be able to show that bottom-up approach and knowing your costs across the board and your profits. Okay. Number 10. This is the gold standard, I would say. End of the day, all things we talked about, right? We talked about productivity. We talked about missing time. We talked about your profits down to the client level. End of the day, when it's all driven out, what you want to try to drive down is your labor as a percentage of revenue. And it's real important when I do this metric, I really look at your handling revenue, right? I don't take into account your pack material revenue. I don't take into account your shipping, working through small parcel in that side. When I'm really comparing apples to apples is looking at my handling revenue against my cost of the work being done against the handling revenue. Really important. I always want to have that cross-checked on what my labor ratios. That's going to be, if I'm at 48% that month, right? What was that productivity that month, right? And you want to be able to start correlating some of those things to what's going on. If you shut up to 58%, what happened? Well, productivity stayed the same. We're over 110%. Oh shoot, indirect went up 15%. Our product mix changed, right? We want to be able to see all those things and make good decisions across the board as you run this. But this is the gold standard. At the end of the day, this is your P&L portion that you look at, right? You want to make sure all those micro goals you have match up into the big one, which is the labor percentage of revenues. Okay. So I think that's it. I think we went through the first 10. Jill, you want to jump on real quick here and let's go a couple items, and if you have questions, let's jump on it.
Yeah, we'll get to Q&A here shortly.
Great.
And if you want to advance one slide, great. So Easy Metrics has all of these metrics at your fingertips and even more. Easy Metrics integrates your WMSs, scanners, time clock data, and even other LMSs data and ERP, so you can finally get the visibility and control that you need to run your operation like a business. So schedule a demo of Easy Metrics on our website, www.easymetrics.com. We will show you a path to lower your labor costs, create defensible labor standards, drive out waste, and best of all, get you up and running quickly in as few as 30 days. So now we will move on to Q&A. If you haven't put any questions in the Q&A, go ahead and pop those in there in the Q&A box, and we will get to them in the order in which they were asked. So I will start things off. Chris asked, how many metrics are enough to set labor standards? How much is enough?
That's a great question. A couple things here, right? I think this could be a slippery slope, right? There's a fine line, I think, between enough standards that becomes fair for an employee or for a process, right? And let's just do two big examples, right? Two things are totally separated art on the number of volume of metrics. One is put away, right? We've talked about that. To me, that's really a 2-metric process. If you're able to track these, right? One is the pallets you're touching, and then a feet you traveled. The other side of the spectrum, you're dealing with each picking. You could make that into a 10-metric process on each picking. The question is, running a sensitivity analysis to say what's the big drivers, and I would argue on each picking, there's probably 5 you're dealing with. 6 through 10 probably do drive some, but it's probably less than 10% value that drive that. Meaning, if it's those last 6 to 10 make big swings, they're not going to change one's productivity very much. Maybe important to have for visibility purposes for metric ratios, but I think it's important to be able to look at that and make a decision objectively by what's really driving those. And I think overdoing it, which I see it happens a lot. People get super excited when they get into LMS or have a modeling. They want to track everything, and sometimes everything is not needed for a fair productivity score. Good question.
Great. So Shelby asks, what do you find is acceptable gap time? 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Do you want to clarify how you see gap time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Answer. It depends on the process. And I would actually argue if it's, customer A, let's use, let's do case picking for a second, shall we? What that activity is going to be, and maybe it's the same process. If it's 2 different companies, completely different. How their setup is going to be unique. So I think it's going to be very interesting. It's unique at the facility level, I would argue, right? It's unique by process. And, I use this kind of a rule set, right? You got to determine what's your average. If you're going to be picking, you're picking the box, you're scanning 1 every 5 minutes. That's been kind of your average you've been running here. Gap time to me, I double it. I give it 10. And then I would then hold them accountable in the past those 5 minutes, minutes 6 through 10, that they're going to be into a gap time or missing time, assuming your average is about 5 minutes per scan. So that's kind of the rule I have. So I think one is, it is unique. It needs to be consistent on that side. And it depends on the process. I mean, that example was a 10-minute gap time I gave there. I'd be completely different on put away. That gap time could be 20 minutes because they're doing zone put away. And maybe the zone's in a far back corner of the facility. It's going to take them 10 minutes to even get there in the first place in a safe manner. So I think it comes down to those 2 areas, but I really want to look at those 2 areas. Okay. Good question.
Okay. Brian asks, regarding cadence, when are you reporting at an executive level and also with management? How much visibility is enough? What are some kinds of examples of reports that you might need there?
Yeah. I will start this way first, right? I think it's important to know that people learn in 3 different ways, right? I think there's a kinetic way of learning, auditory, right, and visual. So you got to start there. And particularly the front line, this I think is really important. And I think you should be able to hit all 3. So on the front line level, I think definitely dailies is a minimum standard, right? So you can punch up reports on performance of the other group. If you don't feel comfortable using their name, use their ID, use their employee ID at that point where they have, and be able to screen up how they're doing, top performer or the worst performer, right? Be able to speak to someone or have a piece of paper to give to an employee that day, how they did that day, how Susie or Johnny did is important. I think that's important on a daily. You swing the other side. Now I'm an ops manager. Now I'm a GM. I think a daily feedback, but a different report, which is kind of a macro report, how the facility is doing, how the shift's doing, how the department's doing. I think it's important. And of course, when you're going on your monthly performance with the executive team, obviously it's going to be monthly. There's certain reports you want to look at and cross-reference. We talked more about overall ELS, your effectiveness. I mean, there's probably 4 or 5 metrics we talked about. I would put that as part of your KPIs, measured against your profitability that month also. And those are some of the big ones, right? Your overtime percentage, your indirect percentage, your effectiveness, which is again all be all. I think those are some baseline metrics you should use on a monthly basis that goes against how you guys perform on your P&L. Good question.
Great. Thank you. So Leonard asks, how can these metrics be communicated to the operational floor? Are there best practices, and which metrics are associate specific?
Associate specific. I think, all right, well, a couple of things. I think I mentioned before about the floor communication, right? I definitely think it's a daily activity and it needs to be posted. I'm a big believer on posting it and also having conversations with employees. We have a tool, kind of a scorecard scenario that we kind of give to our supervisors and leads, in which it gives them both the great performers, and it's almost, I call it the Santa Claus list, right? Who's naughty, who's nice list, right? And this report really breaks out the essence of the people. And you want to promote the people. It's kind of the, congratulating people who performed well the day before is important. And doing that at a pre-shift meeting is fantastic. I love those. When you do a stretch meeting, you're going through, you want to talk people up who did a great job. The ones that are not doing well, look, you don't want to coach Johnny if an opportunity he's had one bad day. So he scored a 60% one day, but his last 60-day average is 103. Is it really needed to talk to Johnny that day? Probably not, right? But if you have Billy, who has been averaging 60% the last 60 days, and he scored, and he did a goose egg, and he pulled a 40%er on you, those are the ones you want to be able to take action on. So we built toolings in place to be able to do the vital few, the highs and the lows, and let the middles really build up through competition, through visibility, and through communication that way to get performance up at a department level and a shift level. Does that answer your questions? Hopefully I did.
Yeah, I think so. So Shelby asks, how do you measure graveyard shifts versus day shifts? Is there a typical LMS percentage difference? For example, is it acceptable that a graveyard shift performs at 80% while the day shift is at a 95% average?
Yeah, I can get myself in trouble on this one. I don't believe in that. I really don't. I'd love to have Shelby call me offline. We can have a conversation on this, but I really believe if they're doing the same process across the board, it shouldn't matter if they're working graveyard or working day shift. Now, you could argue and say, well, Carl, look, the people we're getting on graveyard is just not the same quality as day shift. Okay, got it. I totally get that. But do you really want to change your labor standard because of what's going on the hiring side? I think it's a conversation of what you need to do to get people in the door. Do you need to do a bigger base to get in? Do you have an incentive plan to drive it? Right? End of the day, those things I think you could do to still get the people where they need to be and not have two different goals. Okay.
Okay.
That's a tough one. I get that a lot. I get that a lot because look, I've been there. I have been on shift 1, 2, and 3. And you know what? I will say this, Shelby. Funny enough, you get the right culture in shift 3. Those individuals seem their retention stays longer and performance gets better. And why is that? I think it's a unique person that lives in that shift. And I think you get them in, you lock them in, and they're happy. You build a great culture in that group. And I have seen third shift outperform first shift many times. And I love when that happens, by the way. It's awesome. Sorry, Joe, go ahead. I get passionate about that one. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. So, Sue asks 2 questions, actually. How do you reduce missing time?
You reduce missing time. Well, it's a great question. I think it's a macro question, but I start the first thing is visibility. How do you reduce it? First of all, you got to be able to see it, right? So you have to have tooling in place to be able to handle 2 things. A, getting your timekeeping system and what that looked like, what your time there is, and to be able to have tracking abilities to be able to track direct and indirect processes. So that starts there. How do you do that? That's the first thing. And the delta is the area of opportunity you want to go through. And that's going to be, we talked about those, beginning of day, end of day, midday, between middle of the day, maybe they're scans and they take an hour. I don't know, they get lost in the warehouse for a half hour, who knows? But I think it's what you need is the data. And we talked about what is, and then you're taking action on that the next day, right? And same thing. I guess I call this a Santa Claus list too. We have a thing called a time card report we use, and we start this off the bat, which really talks about the largest opportunities are up top on this report, and you start working those down. You'll start employees having 6 hours out of 8 hours missing time. And again, a lot of that's going to be they don't know what they don't know, and they need to be trained. And you start getting to a point where your greatest offenders are now 2 hours or an hour or 0.5 hours and 0.25 hours. You keep switching that down lower and lower to the point where your missing time is below 5%. And to me, that's important. And I know I mentioned before, day one, don't be shocked when you see 30, 40% missing time. It just happens. But I do expect when people do this and you manage this daily, that you can't be below 5%. No reason at all. Good question.
And the second part of that question was, can you give some examples of the few indirect processes that you should be tracking rather than tracking all of them?
Yeah, well, I guess the question was all of them. That's a loaded question, but what's the vital few? We talked earlier, right? You have meetings. So what are those? That could be your startup meeting. That's going to be one, right? You may have a monthly meeting you go through. So maybe that's you can still put those all into one bucket in the meetings. Training's a big one. Both the training and trainer, right? You can argue both points on that one, right? Cleanup. Right. There are things that do happen. You have to do cleanup in that process here. Right. And then you have other ones that you can argue and say, well, this is not, and we use a terminology called billable indirect, which you have processes where they're not on the floor, but they're working to support the team. So you have desk clerks putting packing lists together and such forth. That could be one. And that's going to be billable indirect. I don't consider that indirect. If you have a yard goat hostler out there or a yard goat, right? I don't know what you guys call it, wherever you're on the country, everyone has a different terminology for it. But that, I consider that billable indirect, but you want to track that. And in those situations, we build a tooling where you auto assign those automatically in there. If they do anything else, they'll be turned on. If they do any scanning, that's great. But then to go back to their billable indirect processes. But I would say no more than those handful that I'd go through. You'd probably want to attack. If you start breaking things down into micro, what type of meetings you're doing, or what type of cleaning you're doing, right? You could slice and dice this thing 1,000 ways. The question you have to ask yourself, are you going to be driving value by tracking that one process? Maybe you are. If you in your operation, if you really say, hey, Carl, I really need to look at X and there's a strong use case, then let's do it. But I just be very careful because people many times get out of control. I've seen operations literally using 23 processes that are just indirect. That end of the day, they use it less than 5%. Why are we doing it? So good question.
Okay. Great. And another question, this is specific to the functionality of VC Metrics. From a software perspective, do all the metrics and reporting have root cause capability? So start high, click and drill down to the root cause.
Interesting. So I'll make sure I'm clear. So I'm trying to, this is an industrial engineer question.
So
I get.
Yeah, I think it's drilling down to the root of the issue, I think is the theme of this question. Yeah,
so let me address that. So is there a click down that goes to exactly who did it and what happened? Short answer is yes. If you want to click down, and here I'll give an example. We have one process. We have a report called the cost breakdown report, and you can look at it and say you're in department picking, right? You see all the scores, and now you want to see. You look at line and say everything looks great except, oh my gosh, pallet picking is 62%. You can click in that deal. What happened there? I got 5 individuals, 2 are doing great, 3 are really doing poorly. You can drill down there on each one of those individually, say, okay, what did Billy, Mark, and Susie do that day? And what happened there? Now, at that point, you can drill down. Now you know their performance. You can see the metrics they did, right? They performed at. And now you can be able to take action there. Now, I would also argue you probably want to flip out of that deal and be able to then look at a comparison of, okay, was it a bad ratio day for these guys? What happened that day that causes havoc? So be able to drill down the why. In our tooling, yes, we have the ability to do that, and we use that a lot. I train that a lot, actually. Good question.
Yeah. Okay, here's another question. I would imagine there is resistance by employees to being monitored every minute of the day. How do you introduce these metrics in a way that is not threatening to minimize resistance and gain acceptance?
Oh man, that's a 4-hour conversation. I'll try to drill it in less than 2. I think it starts with the communication, right? Let's start there. I mean, when we build this out to a client or multi-facilities, right, it's really important we talk about how this is going to be introduced to the front line. Really important. And we talk about who the sponsors are going to be, who the champion is going to be. At the end of the day, the champion of this project is really responsible to building the plan to roll that communication out. What you don't want to do is surprise and just dump in everybody's lap on Tuesday, right? We don't want to do that. But I think there's a really structured plan to go through and start introducing this conversation, both at monthly meetings, if you have your pre-meetings to talk about what we're starting to do. We roll this thing out of a kind of a 30, 60, 90 days. So you're talking about missing time first, really simple, easy to have a conversation with. And it's not where it's one's being argumentative. You're taking the conversation of not what you're doing, right? But how you're doing it and what's happening. And you're trying to help them along. So I think the big message is how you're going to communicate that to the employees also. But I think it's important that they have a real structured plan. I always recommend about using a nice presentation, no more than 4 to 5 slides, talking about what the plan is, and do another one again during midstream, how it's going. And hey, you guys have heard about missing time now. You've heard about indirect time. This is our next step, right? Those are steps to go through that needs to be ran by the champion and then directed downstream to everybody else. And then inspect the expect that it's being done, and have an open door policy. People have questions, be open about it, right? Last thing, if you start hiding the perceptions you're hiding something, that's the death of it at that point. I think being open and excited about it, and the true reason we talked about at the beginning of the slide, you want your end user to have a great experience. If you don't have end users, you don't have clients, you don't have customers, you don't have a warehouse. You don't have a warehouse, you don't have a job. So I think they understand the why behind this is really important. I think that's a good question. Other one I'm going to give a little snippet to, and I did this as a little trick back in the day when I was younger in the day. I was on the floor working. I think people can relate to this one. Every warehouse, every department, every shift has influencers. And what are influencers? We all know what influencers are. These are the guys and gals in the break room. When they talk, people listen. I can almost call it E.F. Hutton. Maybe I'm aging myself in the commercial E.F. Hutton. When E.F. Hutton talks, people listen, right? When they talk, people listen, they trust them. And I think it's real important to be able to get those influencers on your side. So how do you do that? You spend a little more time with them, right? You explain a little more to them. You get them bought in, and that catches fire. I can speak multiple examples that I had where I knew these influencers, and it just helped me. Now, is the end all be all? No, but I will tell you it's really important to have that experience and working that team on the same side as you and same at the table is really powerful. There's your tidbit for the day on that one. All right.
Excellent. Jonathan asked a similar question, and also this one. I'm not sure we have the right data for this. What are the basic data and systems to input into this that we would need?
Good question. 3, basically, right? One's a timekeeping system, right? The second one is your WMS system, and I don't need to have it customized to the nth degree. I just need to have a data dump to me that's going to give the following items, right? We need to know who did it, right? The employee, right? What time they did it, right? A timestamp. Where they did it from or to, right? And we'd be able to look at the data and be able to tell what they did. I can tell the difference between if it was a put away or if I was going to be receiving or if I was doing each pick, right? Those are the 2. The last one, and we talk about this, right, is the way to capture indirect, right? So we do it off the time clock system. Love that. Can you do it off your WMS system? That's great. Coding right off your scanner. I keep doing this all the time, but you can use your RF scan, old school RF scanner. And then the third one option, you can use our job track solution to be able to use that. Have a kiosk on the floor. We'll track those handful of processes that we can't scan on. Those are the basic 3. Don't be scared. I mean, this is the great thing about our system that I love. It's really agnostic to the data. I don't really care what data you're giving to us, right, or where it's coming from. As long as it has those core features, we're good. And that makes, I think, it makes it very usable, makes it easy, right, to get you guys rolled in. Cool.
Great. Well, I think, we have another question here. Why is travel and distance tracking important?
That's a great question. A couple things here, right? We gave the example before, put away is a great use case, right? I think it's important and I'll use 2 examples. I'll use Karl Kohler and Jill Ketos, 2 different employees on the floor, right? If Karl Kohler is given all these putaways and they're all literally 1 bay over from the receiving door, 22, right? I'll be able to do 35 pallets an hour. I should be at least, right? if Jill has a door next door in door 23, and she has to go 22 aisles down to put the same amount of pallets away, do you think that's fair? And her units per hour are going to be half, maybe even less than that. You'd be lucky to get 15 pallets an hour going that back and forth and back and forth. So I think it's important in the sense of processes where you're traveling point to point that makes it fair, right? Makes it fair labor standard that we're going to give so much time per foot traveled. So if you have a harder job, that you're given equal time in the sense of being able to be scored equally in that sense. That's why it's important. And we can use that. You can use travel as a metric. You can talk about a lot of other metrics that I think are important when you do a process. They're going to drive time and they're a labor driver. You'd like to track those. Okay.
And what do you use to track the travel?
Oh, the what? I came in not hearing. So the what? So our experience, we mentioned before.
I'm adding this as a second part of the question.
You're adding it. Maybe I didn't hear properly. I thought I was getting.
I'm adding to it.
See how you are, keto. You're making my life hard. All right, let's go. All right, so a couple ways. One is we want to be able to see the data, right? So in the data line, I got to know the from and or to where we're going to into things. So I'm going to bin location B2. That's what I'm picking from. Then I go to D14, the next location. I got to know that. So if I'm seeing that in the data stream, right? Which most time you do, right? And then what we use a travel matrix tool where we overlay the map of the facility, know your locations in there. We know the distances, right? Using AutoCAD or other tooling we have to be able to do that and be able to get blocks of travel from point A to point B. So maybe that one location's in A1 zone and we're going to A5 zone. We know that's 86 feet between those two zones, and then we'll to add that travel to that activity. That's how we'd handle that. Not a very complicated process. What we need there is a map of the facility, know the distances between aisles, right, and the size of the facility, and then lastly, a master bin list of every bin you use in that location, so we can be able to accommodate that and put that as a metric. Good question, Ms. Jill Keto.
I was wondering. Okay, here's a question. In this competitive labor environment, how can we frame this to the team as a priority?
And I guess the question, I got to know who the team is. That's kind of a hard one. So I'll make some assumptions here, right? If you're saying in a competitive market, how do you make this a priority to the team? Okay, Jill, what do you think? I'm trying to see what would you define team as, you think? Any idea?
I think rather, because if companies are focused on just getting people, and right now getting people to work and being able to recruit people, and that's the focus perhaps right now. How do you then layer on top of the importance of all these metrics? When you're just trying to, retain the people that you have. Yeah,
that's a great point. This has been interesting because I think this market has been like this since COVID, right? Let's all on the call agree and shake our heads that this has been tough, right? It's been tough to keep. It's been tough to keep people, right? When they can be able to keep a certain salary and not have to work, it's hard for them to get them off the couch, right? So for Ryan, this has come up a lot. I mean, this topic has hit more. God, I've been doing this for how many years? 20 years, 25 years doing this. This last 12 months of hearing the word how to keep good in people and using incentive to do so has been a huge deal. So the topic that I've seen a lot is pay for performance. We call it gain share. But to be able to use the metrics here, and we talk again, I keep saying this again, fair and consistent standards, and put in a incentive plan to retain those people and to attract people into this deal has been important. We worked with a group up in the Midwest, upper Midwest, that the only reason they chose us, right, and want to work with us primarily was to get an incentive plan together. Now they had a bunch of wins behind that, right? They got missing time down, they got indirect time. Their margins have gone up, but the big key was they were in a 4-mile radius. They were competing against 3 other big retailers, and they had 3,000 jobs, and they're competing in a small town with 3,000 jobs. And this is a way to level set them to be able to pay for it or to gain share. Where you're not coming out of pocket and hoping you get the money, If you know for every dollar you're saving, you're going to split that 50 cents, 25 cents to every dollar to the employee, and be able to attract employees. I think it's huge to be able to use these metrics to relay that into a pay for performance or a gain share opportunity. And I'm a huge believer on pay for performance. I would say our past company, IMS, before we rolled out Easy Metrics, we wouldn't have been as successful as we were without pay for performance, hands down. I think Dan would agree with me 100% that was the end all be all. Because back in those days, our market baseline was $9.25 an hour, right? We were paying people on average $14 an hour. We were the top paying warehouse in a 15-mile radius, and wasn't $1 spent on marketing. Literally, the marketing team and the recruiting team would open the door. They walk in, they had to get past everybody in the hallway because they're all lined up to get their job for Monday, and they'd have referrals. So I think it's a big deal to be able to do that, to use these metrics to be able to compete in the market, to keep great people and bring in great people. Okay.
Excellent. Well, Karl, thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. I think everyone here learned a ton, and to the audience, thank you so much for attending. We are going to be following up with a recording of this webinar. So please send us any questions that you may have, and let us know how we can continue being a resource for all things related to your operational workforce, cost, and performance. So have a great day, everybody, and we will see you soon.
Thanks, Betty. Thanks, Jill.
Bye-bye.